Okay.
Right. Welcome everybody to the Earth Exchange Cafe, the second in the series of the Spirit Spring. We are here in the cafe with Stephen Blackmer, and I am so delighted to welcome you all here. And while we settle on in to our cafe, I invite us to close our eyes and take a breath. And release that breath, release any tension. And into that space, allow that feeling of being in a warm, cozy cafe to enter into your consciousness. The best kind of cafe. The kind of cafe that you love to go to over and over again, each month. Where you know that you will meet old friends, hear riveting and juicy stories. You'll be surrounded by the music, the art, the books, the articles of all of those people who have connected to Radical Joy for Hard Times and the Earth Exchange over the last 3.5 years. And you're sitting in your absolute favorite chair, the one that you go to every time. And you've got your favorite warm drink in your hand. And you're readying for the rich conversation that's to come. And before we do that, we welcome in the spirits of inspiration and the overview that gives us a sense of seeing the bigger picture. We welcome in also the fire of creativity and inspiration of activity and all the things that help us to be active in the world. And we also bring in wisdom, the wisdom of those who've gone before us and the voices of those whose work we're continuing in our own lives. And we also welcome in community, a sense of belonging, and all of the people around us who help us, and we help them to be ourselves. And they're all here in the cafe. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Joey to introduce Stephen.
Thank you, Harriet. That was beautiful. Greetings, everybody, and welcome to our new edition of Earth Exchange Cafe. About 8 or 9 years ago, about half a dozen of my friends sent me this article, or a link to an article in Harper's Magazine called The Priest of the Woods. And they said, you have to meet this man. And so I introduced myself to Stephen Blackmer, and we did in fact meet, and I have visited his church in New Hampshire. He is the founding and executive director of Kairos Earth and chaplain of the Church of the Woods. He began this path in a very, very interesting way, which we will talk about, after spending 30 years as a conservationist, having founded and built conservation organizations. There was a dramatic and magical, truly, midlife shift that led him to Yale Divinity School and ordination as a priest in the Episcopal Church. He's the minister of the Church of the Woods, which is in Canterbury, New Hampshire, and he's the founder of Kairos Earth, a nonprofit. As sacred, and to restore this awareness as a foundation of both religious practice and practical action to conserve the earth. So, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. We're both really excited about this conversation.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a real treat to be here.
think the video is frozen for a minute. If you would
Mm.
tell us the remarkable story of how you came to this path after your years as a conservationist.
Oh golly, it's a long story. It began in 2005 with a wilderness sojourn in the Mojave Desert of Southern California.
We were the video was frozen for quite a few seconds, so I don't know if you said anything. I'm gonna put my video off.
Okay. It began with a wilderness sojourn in the Mojave Desert in Southern California, the core of which was 4 days of fasting and a guided fasting vision quest. And it would take us more than the whole hour to describe that in detail, but I found myself prompted by an unseen voice to walk around the mountain I was on in the middle of the night, in a wilderness that I had never been before, without trails, without map, without anyone knowing what I was doing. I set off around this mountain, and in the middle of the night found myself turned around by running literally into a wall of rock, and found my way back, knowing that my life had utterly changed, but not knowing what that meant. That was the beginning. And it went on from there. Little did I expect that I would find myself in divinity school and being ordained as a priest, because I'd never been to church in my life. So that's another part of the story. But
yeah, so would you tell that part of the story? Because it really is quite fascinating. And Harry, we are having freezing situations with the video, so you might want to turn your video off too. It might help.
no,
Yeah, so
fine.
I mean, when you heard that voice when you were over Ireland.
Yes, and then there was a second stage. I was I'd been at a retreat, a workshop on becoming an authentic leader, and was flying home to Boston with a stopover in Dublin. And as the airplane came down over the runway, over the airport in Dublin, a voice came, again out of thin air, as it were, that said, "Priest, you're to be a priest." And I knew it was true in that moment, in that instant. I said, I know this is true. What does it mean? What kind of a priest? And I spent the next several years trying to understand that. I found myself called, to my great surprise and often resistance, deeply into the Christian tradition as a way of expressing this call to live a spiritual life in relationship with the earth, but through a Christian tradition. And found myself going to Yale Divinity School 2 years later after that. And when I was finished with that, being ordained in the Episcopal Church, again, all to my enormous surprise. But here I am.
It's an extraordinary story, and especially, I don't know, to me, it's particularly fascinating that it happened over Ireland, where
Yes, it makes sense. My Dexter ancestors, my middle name is Dexter, my mother's father's family would approve. They were from County Wicklow, which is not that far from Dublin. So, and my grandfather's farm here in Vermont was Wicklow Farm. So
they were calling you.
They were calling
so
me.
what was it about? How did you come to choose the Episcopal Church? I mean, first Christianity and then the Episcopal Church, because you say you've never been to church in your life. So, you could have chosen a more kind of a secular path, like, I don't know, Unitarian Universalism or ethical culture or something like that.
I could have. What I would say is that the Christian tradition chose me rather than me choosing it. And that happened. I mean, the number of mystical experiences that have guided me in this are more than I can count. Direct encounter with Jesus, to my, again, enormous surprise, but compelling influence. that it was simply the language of the Christian tradition that was speaking to me. And somehow I had to respond to that. The Episcopal Church I came to partly because, as I would tell people this story, and more than any said, well, you should explore the Episcopal Church. And I didn't know very much about it, but found my way into it and found that there was room for somebody who had a deep connection with the earth, but expressed it in with beautiful ritual, and ritual that really is ritual that many of my ancestors have spoken. So in a lot of ways, it was coming back to an ancestral tradition that I hadn't grown up with except culturally. But I grew up in a non-religious family, but a family that was very outdoorsy. I'm the only person in my family who has a church connection, although my mother did later in life after I grew up and went away. But the ritual, the liturgical tradition, and the ability to understand the material world as filled with sacred presence, or a sacramental understanding, is present there, even though the church has been very far removed from real connection with the earth.
So tell us about Church of the Woods.
Church of the Woods. So the stories continue. My earlier training was in forestry and forest ecology. That's where I started, and that became a career in forest conservation. And like many people with a forest background, I'd long wanted my own little piece of woods to tend, to care for, to love, to get to know, to work with. And there was a particular piece of land in the town of Canterbury, New Hampshire, where I live and have lived for many years, that a friend had introduced me to and said, you should buy that woodlot. A little over 100 acres, 106 acres, which is somewhere 35 to 40 hectares for people who are measuring in a different system. And I tried to buy it and was not able to, for a variety of reasons, over a period of 7 years. And then finally, the year after I graduated from divinity school in 2012, the land became available again. It came on the market at a lowered price. But it had been terribly logged in the interim, not clear cut, but really devastated, a deeply wounded place. But I was able to buy it that year. And the first time I walked on the land after I had become the owner of it, that disembodied voice came back and just whispered to me, start a church.
Oh,
Start a church. And I responded, you mean like a woods church? I could do a woods church. What's a woods church? And so that has been the question for the last 10, 11 years. What is a woods church? How do you make a church or sacred space out of a devastated, cut over piece of scruffy woodlands in New Hampshire in the Christian tradition? And that's been my charge, my task, my joy, my labor, trying to figure that out. And here we have now a church of the woods.
yeah.
Where the woods themselves is the woods is the sacred space.
The woods is the sacred place. So you don't have an indoor building that people go to.
Well, we do now, because we have rainy days and months of winter. The snow is finally melting here on April the 12th. Our last bits of snow are melting. So a couple of years later, we built a small barn with a wood stove in it to keep us warm, and have since added a couple of other small buildings, including, we can talk about a little bit later, a chapel in Pustinia, where I now live. So we do now actually have buildings, but they are shelters. They're beautiful and simple, but the land remains the sacred space.
Yeah, I read somewhere in your writings, or perhaps it was on your website, that your congregants include the trees.
Yes, that's the first thing that that's important to take notice of is the congregation here is not limited to human beings, but from the first step, that the community is all the human and non-human beings, both living creatures, but also the water and the rocks and the air, the mud, the trees, the foxes, the snowshoe hares, the moose, the on and on and on, that's the entire community. And if I think it's the whole premise begins with that the community of life is bigger than simply human beings, and also that human beings have a very particular role. It is our job to bring that sacred presence, to be the ones who bring that the consciousness of linking the material world and the spiritual world.
So who are your human congregants? My guess would be that they might be Christians who are looking for a more earth-based spirituality or spirituality, and perhaps conservationist ecologists who are looking for a more spiritual vision of their passion, their work.
I had at the outset, I had expected it would be exactly those two. It turned out to be, so far at least, entirely the former, or almost entirely the former.
Oh.
People with a Christian background who are looking for a loving community in harmony with the earth. The Christian nature of this has largely scared off most people with a conservation background who are interested in something else. It's a little too formal, even the way we meet. Since it asks a little too much of entering into the Christian tradition, and so that's part of our work is to help understand how the Christian tradition can be re-understood in a way that makes it more open for people who are interested in that kind of a spiritual approach.
So on that topic, I mean, I'm curious to know how you interweave the Christian tradition, the Episcopal liturgy, with the service. Like, so for example, Easter was just a few days ago. How do you celebrate Easter at Church of the Woods?
We, as I said, we still had snow on the ground on Easter, so we weren't able to do everything we would. So let me tell you what we're going to do this coming Sunday, when the snow is gone and has melted very quickly this week. We begin by walking into the woods. We gather we gather in a small parking area with a dirt driveway, a dirt parking lot, and then walk about 100 yards into the woods and gather on a small knoll. So just from the very beginning, we're in the middle of the woods, we're surrounded by the woods. We spend some time in silence and then sing a little bit and call one another together. The liturgy itself, the ritual I've translated from the standard rituals of the Episcopal Church or the Christian, or most of the Christian tradition, to create a much greater awareness and resonance with an ecological understanding, an evolutionary understanding, a scientific understanding of the earth, as well as a spiritual connection. The core of it is after we read from the Bible and sometimes other things, and then I give a small homily, and then we send people into the woods on their own for 20 minutes of silent reflection, just to be in and with all the other creatures and beings who are present there. And it's that time of silence in the woods that I think most fundamentally changes the nature of the experience. And people come back from that then, and we then we bring back little tokens or treasures of what we may have found in the woods, from a mushroom to a stick to a piece of anything that's fallen on the ground, or a twig or a flower. And we share stories of what we've encountered, what we've thought about, what's going on in our lives. But all in that context of being held in and surrounded by and upon and within the forest itself.
Yeah, and as you know, I think that a big part of our Radical Joy for Hard Times work, when we do our ceremonies for the earth, it always, or usually, it doesn't always entail going and spending time with the place. And as we phrase it, as getting to know the place as it is now, because people
Yes,
think they
right.
know what a place is like, especially a place that's hurt, which they may have been avoiding. But when
Yes.
you actually spend, even like 10, 20 minutes there, something transforms and a relationship builds, and
Yep.
it's just quite extraordinary.
Quite extraordinary. And it happened. We do that, just as it's just built into our pattern of worship or prayer, in a way that's just so completely different from regular churches.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think the reason so many people wrote to me about when they read that article about you and Harper's Priest of the Woods was because there was a section in there where you had been cutting down some trees and on the land, and then you suddenly realized that you hadn't done anything to like to bring the trees into the equation, into
Yes.
the act. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, that's exactly right. I was out clearing trails because one of the things I wanted to do was make the experience of this land a little more accessible, and it's thick and was difficult to navigate and very easy to get lost. So creating some trails to make it a little more accessible and a little safer for people. And so out with my chainsaw, cutting something down, and then I realized, oh my God, I have not given thanks for the life of this tree that I have just taken. And so I must do that. So I I perform the central ritual in a Christian tradition is communion, or the Eucharist, giving thanks for for the life and the death of Jesus, which we celebrated last week. And here I am with this tree, and in effect saying the same thing. Let me give thanks for the life and the death of this tree, as an expression of the entire creation, of the entire incarnation, which Jesus in human form represents, but in fact everything participates in. So I've called that the Chainsaw Eucharist.
The Chainsaw Eucharist.
Chainsaw Eucharist with the stump of the tree that I had killed, that I had cut down, serving as the altar.
Oh.
And on a regular Sunday when we're outdoors, a stump continues, a different stump, but different location, continues to serve as the altar.
Yeah.
And it's a very powerful experience and I celebrate the Eucharist kneeling on my knees, sort of on my knees at the foot of this what had been tree that's been cut down.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah, it's a beautiful and a very powerful thing, and a very different experience from doing so in a formal built environment in an indoor church, where to me the whole of the creation has been walled off. And
Yeah, it makes me think 2 nights ago I stayed at a campsite. I mean, I'm on a book tour now. I stayed at a campsite near Holbrook, Arizona. It was just a dreary campsite, no shade, the highway very close by, lights from a Burger King blazing all through the night, lots of vehicles. And so when I left in the morning, I just thought, oh, I need to make a little beauty for this place.
Yes,
So I just picked some flowers and twigs and things, just dried old flowers, and made a little mandala. Yeah. And instantly my feeling about the place changed. It was like it became alive. It became sweet. It became a place that was still going. Little simple actions like that just continues to astonish me how profound they can be.
It's really amazing, but the act itself and the consciousness that it represents, thanking a place, showing the place itself that it's beautiful, reminding ourselves that beauty, I mean, I'm not telling you anything you guys don't already know so well. We're reminding ourselves that beauty is everywhere, including in the most wounded places. There was a time years and years ago, and during the activist time of my life, when I was in a difficult spot, and one of the practices I created for myself was to every day find a bit of beauty somewhere, in the face of a person, in all kinds of things. I remember in particular one day riding the bus into Boston, where I was working at the time, and looking out the window and seeing a plume of smoke coming out of a smokestack caught by the morning light.
Oh,
And it was stunningly beautiful. This plume of pollution going up into the air was stunningly beautiful. And just, yeah, to remind myself, beauty is everywhere. If we have the eyes to see it and celebrate it.
it's everywhere under all circumstances too.
Under all circumstances. Yeah.
I want to ask you about Kairos Earth. What is your nonprofit, that's the nonprofit you've created, what is the relationship to Kairos Earth, the Church of the Woods? And tell us about Kairos. Why is Kairos a concept that's important, not just for the name of your foundation, but for how we perceive the world at this time, maybe?
Yeah, very, very briefly, organizationally, when we started, the Episcopal Church was supportive of this idea, but also a bit uncertain of it and weren't quite sure what to make of it. So I decided to create a nonprofit organization, which could be the home base for Church of the Woods. Where I'm not sure whether that will continue on for the next 10 years or not, but in any case, it currently still serves as the kind of the base of operations, the organizational home for Church of the Woods. The word kairos is a wonderful word, and thanks for asking. It's a Greek word that means time, but time not in the sense of it's 12 o'clock noon, which is in Greek chronos, time, like chronometer, but in the sense of the time has come, or it is time, or this is the right time. That sense of a propitious moment, a moment for action, a moment for transformation. And in this understanding, it for me is a way of saying it is time to remember the sacredness of the earth. It's time to reconnect the religious tradition of my ancestors. They had many religious traditions, but certainly one of them, of the Christian tradition, to reconnect with the earth. It's the time to put these things back together. It is time for the earth. And all the woes and the wounds of the earth are just one way of understanding that. But it's also the time for to remember the earth is sacred.
And the timing of your journey, receiving that calling and then just finding ways to explore it, without diving in until you were ready to dive in. And then even the timing of how the land for the Church of the Woods came, it wasn't available until after you'd gone to divinity school. And then it's like, well, okay, I guess it's time for him to.
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. Yeah, for 7 years I tried to buy it and was not able to. And in the meantime, it was devastatingly logged. So both I had to get to the ready, but in some way it was also saying, and it's the wounded land that the church has to be created, not some pristine, towering rainforest. It's not that at all. This is a scruffy, cut over, scrappy little piece of woods. And somehow it had to be that too. Sort of we build the church out of wounded place, which is again back to the Christian tradition, partly the cross, built not on pristine, untouched, perfect perfection, but on wounds.
So do you still work with the wounds of the land or other lands now with the church?
We're not working with other lands, still here, but mostly our job here with the land is not to, we don't have to do much with the land. The land is healing itself. What we do is bring that human consciousness of healing, of sacredness, of prayer, of peace. And the way we've worked with the land is by changing it in a deep way. Many people may have experience here of going into a cathedral or another sacred space where people have been for a long time. Certainly outdoor places too. The presence of people in prayer with deep spiritual awareness changes a place. It changes a building. It changes a piece of land. And that's what's been happening here. It's palpably different this place is palpably different over 10 years because of our presence, simply because of our presence, not because of our actions beyond that, but because we're here in love and prayer and peace and healing. It changes the land. Someday I wonder, will scientists understand what is happening? But somehow it changes the very nature. The vibration is a good way to understand it. It changes the vibration of a place, and that's what's happening here.
Yeah. Well, I really agree. And it's, in the late 80s and early 90s, I used to spend a lot of time here in New Mexico and northeastern Arizona writing about an issue with Dene, Navajo, and Hopi. And you can feel the spiritual presence of those lands. And it wasn't hard to come to the realization that the reason that land is so powerful is because it's still being honored, attended to, implicitly interwoven with ceremony. There's a constant receiving and giving between the people and the land, you just feel it even as an outsider.
Yeah. I have a strong suspicion that we're not the first people who have done this on this particular piece of land. I have no historical knowledge of that Native American peoples were here. But I'm pretty sure they were. I'm pretty sure that's why this land called so loudly. That there's something about this particular place that has drawn people before. Yeah.
I'll bet you're right.
We change that in any small place, and sort of my grand dream is that we do that everywhere and we change everywhere. And that will take forever, but we begin one place at a time.
Yeah. And keep tending it.
And keep tending it. Just keep at it and keep at it and keep at it. And if we go away for a while, the land remembers. If we go away too long, it suffers. It really does.
Mm-hmm.
It misses that presence.
Yeah. I want to ask you about your retreat. You mentioned the Postinia, and that this is the place where you live now, and you've written about it. So what happened there? You decided to live where your church is. Is that correct?
Yes. This goes back a little bit to 2018. I just had this strong, so I'd been here on Church of the Woods for about 5 years at that point. I had this great desire to have a retreat space here, a place that I could spend more time, more deeply in the woods, and began with no, I wasn't doing the actual building, but got a friend of mine, the friend who actually first introduced me to the piece of this land, who's he's a creator of sacred space in his own way. To build a little building that could be both a little an indoor chapel, but also a small retreat space. That was being built in the fall of 2019. It was just being finished early in 2020. When COVID came, that in particular that February and March, I had an overwhelming call to come into this space for a period of quarantine. My initial thought was that I would come here for 40 days, which is where the word quarantine comes from, quaranta, for a 40-day period of retreat. And the 40 days, particularly in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is a very powerful symbol, beginning with Noah and the ark, 40 days and 40 nights it rained, and the Israelites in the desert, 40 years they wandered, and Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days. It's a period of transformation. It signifies a transformation of state of being, a transformation of consciousness. So I said, oh, I will go into the woods for a period of 40 days. And when the 40 days ended, I found I couldn't leave. I had to keep staying here. So then it delved deeply into the traditions, the Christian traditions of withdrawing into the wilderness, and in particular was called to a Russian tradition from the Russian Orthodox Church of entering into what the Russians call as a pustinya, which the pustinya in Russian is literally the word for desert, to go into the desert for a period of time, which was following the tradition of the very first monastics, the monks of the Christian tradition who fled the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries, when the Christian tradition was being overtaken by the Roman Empire, become a creature of the empire. And men and women fled into the desert of Egypt and Syria and Palestine, and became called the desert fathers and desert mothers. And really from them, the Christian monastic tradition was born, and then spread to Italy, and then particularly to Harriet's world, to Ireland and the north of England, and during the early Middle Ages. So the pustinya is a Russian tradition of entering into the forest for a period of time. So I realized here I was. I had moved into not just a chapel in the woods, but into a pustinya. And that was March and April of 2020. And here I still am. So I've been living here for 3 years now. It's a little tiny space with a solar system off grid, a well with just cold water and a hand pump. So very, very, very simple, but an utterly beautiful small space right in the middle of the woods. I now finally made some compromises and got a satellite internet connection just 6 months ago, so that I can talk with people like this. But before that, I had a very limited internet connection for 2.5 years and had to leave here to do Zoom or anything. So I've been here for 3 years. I love it. It's hard sometimes, and I don't know what happens next. But it's a way of being more deeply present. The breath of God, the spiritual awareness that's here and deep within. And simply, above all, it's simply being present to that.
Yeah, it really does feel like kind of a natural step, doesn't it, for you?
Yes, it does. And yeah, as I say, and I don't know what happens next. So, among other things, it's enabled me to reduce my carbon footprint and some other good things, but that's not remotely why I did it. It is a very simple way of living, but I still have a car. I don't drive it as much, but all of that stuff. Yeah. And now I have a satellite internet, which compromise.
Well, I have a couple more questions for you, Harriet, but I wondered, for you, Stephen, but I wonder, Harriet, if you have some questions you'd like to bring in.
Oh, I'm really enraptured listening to you, Stephen, and I've just got onto the internet to the cabin that I've just found in the website that you've created with your blog, and it does look so beautiful. And I wonder, just talking about that kind of sense of retreat and how all of us, I think, in a certain way, found that COVID was very much like that. That we stepped outside of ordinariness. And I wonder whether you could speak a little bit about things like when we allow the natural, the sort of cultures of business as usual, getting back to normal, to sort of seep back into our understanding. We've been very connected to the forest, figuratively as well as literally, but now we are bringing back Wi-Fi and we are getting creature comforts. And I wonder whether you've got something to say to that.
Oh golly, yeah. Say this, I mean, this whole experience has been a mystery that I don't understand. It takes effort to not be completely sucked back into all of those things. So much of our world is about the comforts and the connections, and the opportunity to have a conversation like this is a great blessing that without the internet simply isn't possible. But to try and figure out what are the practices and disciplines that help us be connected first to where we are, and help our bodies be connected. Maybe that's a way to say it, is to remain as embodied as possible, which our bodies in relationship with the places that we live, while even then our voices and our faces can connect a long distance. But to remember the sacredness of being in our bodies, and to living in the simplicity that often requires. But it's a funny thing to do. It's not something I ever dreamed about. It's just something that happened. Like all of this, I never dreamed I'd be a priest. I never dreamed, I mean, none of this stuff. It just happened.
I'm trusting having the internet on for a minute, since it seems to have worked for Harriet. It seems to me that a huge responsibility for all spiritual leaders right now is helping their congregation move into climate change and through climate change, and so I wondered how Church of the Woods, how you and your congregation are entering this very, very, very challenging time.
Yeah. And maybe just expand it a little bit. It's climate change, but it's all the other wounds that we've inflicted on the world, on the earth around us, and I think particularly about ecological communities and species that have been destroyed, harmed, people taking up way more than our reasonable allotted share of the earth. In the Christian tradition, the story of the crucifixion of Jesus on the cross is probably the most powerful and central symbol. I think one of the hardest things to face is that we're not going to stop or fix. We're not going to stop climate change quickly, and we're not going to fix the damage. We're going to have to live our way through it. Mm-hmm. And there will be enormous suffering there. I mean, this is all well underway already. This is not a new thing. And loss and grief. We're not going to simply electrify the world and all of a sudden everything's going to get better. It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. We're way too far down the path. So I think one of the great tasks of spiritual leaders is not only to join the activist community and try to stop things, but to prepare people to walk through death. How do we live with what we are doing? How do I live with the consequences of what we are doing? How do we live with the understanding that we, by our actions, and as I said, I drive a car and I fly on airplanes, and not as much as I used to, but still plenty. How do we live with the understanding that we are deeply complicit, no matter what we do, deeply complicit? It's one thing we can go blame the oil companies, and sure, oil companies and lots of others, but we still buy products made with those things. We still buy all kinds of things that have those kinds of effects in the world. How do we live with that? How do we reckon with using a difficult word from the Judeo-Christian tradition, with our own sinfulness, with our own complicity. How do we walk through a time when life on earth, the diversity of life on earth, is already shrinking? That's really painful stuff. And I think it's the task of spiritual leaders to help us navigate that. Trusting somehow that the world will be okay. Will human beings be okay? I'm not sure about that. Ecologically, the world will be fine. It's recovered from extinctions, massive destructions before. It just takes millions and billions of years, time frames that are meaningless to us, but not meaningless to life. Boy, they're hard questions.
Yeah, and you've asked several really important, hard questions, and I wonder, we could spend years exploring each of the questions you ask. How do we live through all this? But do you have a couple of answers or a couple of tips that answer those questions about of how do we live through this?
How do we live with it? Well, I think what Radical Joy does is one wonderful way, is finding beauty everywhere, all the time, in everything. Finding, again, using Christian language, finding resurrection everywhere. New things are constantly springing up, in infinite variety and abundance. And often the littlest things can remind us of the incredible power of life. Perhaps the most important thing, and the one that I'd say we practice most at Church of the Woods, although we practice these, is simply loving everything.
Mm.
We love the broken things, love the wounded things, love the people who do this damage, starting with ourselves. If we do that, then there is healing, then there is renewal. If we spent much more time loving people than criticizing, blaming, above all blaming, it's so much easier to put blame somewhere else than to love somebody. So, I mean, these are practices deep in the Christian tradition, but not limited to the Christian tradition. But to confront our own grief and transform it into love, that's a powerful thing to do. It is not easy, which is why we do it in community. It's why we use tradition to support us. It's why we enact it with rituals. But that's mostly what we do at Church of the Woods. We come here and we love each other and we love the woods, and we grieve, we mourn, we lament, we rejoice, we eat, we sing. Pretty basic human stuff. I mean, really basic human stuff. Those are the things that carry us through.
And I would add that you maintain an active relationship. So, we're just about out of time. We're going to have a closing, but I wanted to read something that I found that you wrote when you were creating a trail for Church of the Woods. And you started off with the trail, and that you had the congregants were there and you were working on it together. And this is what you wrote about creating a trail and what it means. A trail is a co-creative act between a place and a traveler. A trail is a witness to those who have come before, evidence of relationships past. A trail transforms itself and the traveler every time it is walked. A trail is one way of knowing, changing every day. That's so beautiful. I mean, that is a way of bringing consciousness to the relationship between a place and people and the journey that they engage on together. And it seems to me that that's a really, really important thing that we also can do as we go through these hard times with the earth, is to strengthen that connection.
Yeah. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. I had forgotten those words altogether.
Well, they're beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
And you did tie in the inner journey and the journey of which is, that's what all great trail stories are about. It's about the inner journey as well as the outer journey. That's why we read them.
Yeah, one mapped on the other. Yeah.
Mhm. So I just have one more question, and then Harriet can lead us out, or else perhaps read questions from people. I wanted to ask you if you still get guidance from the voice that's been guiding you all this time.
No, the voice has not come in quite a while. I think
Okay.
that my guess is it's done its job,
Uh-huh.
but we'll see. We'll see.
It may be back. I suspect it will.
It may be back, or maybe that, I don't know, I have to go on my own. I brought you this far, and now it's up to you. We'll see.
Maybe.
We'll see. I don't know. Yes, and then of course one wonders who is the voice, and where does it come from, and all such ineffable questions.
Yeah, and will we listen to it? I mean, that to me, that's
And
the
will
great
we
question.
listen?
You listened. It would
Yes,
have been easy to just say, forget it. I'm not interested in that. I have a job already.
it would have been easier.
So Harriet, do you have, further question? We have a few minutes, further questions from people who are listening, or we can just come out right now with the concluding journey. I mean, the concluding.
Yeah, thank you for the people who've been watching on Facebook, but there's no questions come up. Usually we do receive a few more questions afterwards on Facebook, or when it gets uploaded onto YouTube. So that is usually the process. And thank you so much for your beautiful thoughts. I do usually close the circle, but I'm wondering whether you would be kind enough to close the circle for us in your own meaningful way that feels right for you. You don't have to, no pressure. Haven't asked you this before, but if you would,
okay.
that would be great.
I'd be glad to. Thank you. Well,
Good.
with the inspiration of the woods, the earth outside my window, let's just take a minute to be silent, wherever each of us may be. And this day I give thanks for the green of the towering pine trees out my window. I give thanks for the pile of firewood stacked for next winter. I give thanks for the sun shining through dim high clouds. I give thanks for the melting snow running in the brook. I give thanks for the bare branches of the trees that are yet to leaf out. I give thanks for the calling of the winter wren I heard this morning. I give thanks for the cool earth that is warming today. I give thanks for this conversation. I give thanks for all those who have joined us. I give thanks for the power that has brought this all into being. I give thanks for the blessing of our lives this day. Amen.
That's beautiful.
Thank you all.
Everybody for being with us. And we will see you next month. I'm sorry, I can't remember who's going to be with us next month, but we will see you next month and we will post that.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. It's been a real treat. And thank you all who are
It's
listening
been
now
beautiful.
in the future.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.